Okay, I think we'll get started. It's good to see everyone tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Keith, Dean of the Architecture Division at CCA. Thanks for joining us for this conversation tonight with 5 members of our CCA Architecture faculty, Kristen Smith and Ryan Keerns, Clark Thenhaus, Mark Donohue, and Thom Faulders. Conversation will be about the relationship between pedagogy practice and their entries to the recent Urban Confluence competition in San Jose. This is the 5th event of our fall 2021 architecture lecture series. Please note that should you want to, you can enable closed captioning at the bottom of your Zoom window with the live transcript button. At CCA, we understand land acknowledgement as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. California College of the Arts campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors indigenous peoples past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those in the lands from which you're joining us virtually today. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I'd like to tell you about the next event in our series. On Wednesday, November 10th at 5 p.m., CCA professors and co-directors of CCA's History Theory Experiments Lab, Irene Chang and James Graham, will host the Materialities of Architectural Discourse, a conversation with a group of young voices in contemporary criticism, Jess Myers, Kate Wagner, and Cruz Garcia and Natalie Frankowski, to explore the new mediums and platforms through which architectural theory is happening today. I'll share with you now. Whoops. Need to find a way to do this more smoothly. Scaffold, which is CCA Architecture's online content platform where you can look at the full lecture series for the fall. If this works successfully. Can you see my screen? Well, you can see the full calendar there, but you'll also find stories by and about our students, faculty, and alumni, including a story about tonight's event, an interview that Catherine Jemima Hamilton conducted with the 5 participants, which I'm just sort of scrolling through here, where they talk about the competition entries and their work in teaching at CCA. You can find that at scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. I'd now like to introduce our speakers and get the conversation started. Tonight, our 5 CCA faculty members will share their entries to the 2021 Urban Confluence competition, after which we'll have a discussion of the broader themes that connect this work to their teaching, research, and practice here at the college. Now I'll briefly introduce the speakers in the order that they'll present, and then we'll get started. Somebody needs to be muted, I think.
Similar to the SAT. So like,
hold on. Okay. I was going to find the guilty party, but not shame them, but just quiet them. Okay. Ryan Keerns and Kristen Smith, both adjunct professors at CCA Architecture, are co-founders of Keerns Smith, a design practice influenced by their combined interest in art, landscape, and technology. Together, they work on projects, both real and speculative, to create spaces that connect people to their environments and to each other. Their work is both analytical and creative, often prioritizing the practical constraints of context and budget in order to produce innovation. Recent projects include workplace renovations, residential renovations and additions, custom homes, and speculative research into how we house growing populations and enhance public spaces while addressing climate change. Clark Thenhaus, founding director of endemic architecture, is an assistant professor at CCA. A licensed architect in California and Colorado, he earned his Master of Architecture degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a Bachelor of Environmental Design degree from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Clark is a recipient of many awards, including most recently an Architects Newspaper 2020 Best of Design Award. In 2015, he received the Architectural League Prize for Young Architects. His work has been widely published, and in 2019, he published the book, Unresolved Legibility in Residential Types, to great acclaim. Endemic architecture's work leverages architecture's primary mediums, buildings, drawings, models, images, diagrams, installations, and writing, as a means for shifting the arc of attention by creating architecture that he calls almost familiar. Mark Donohue, our third speaker, is an assistant professor and former chair of the Bachelor of Architecture program at CCA. Before joining the faculty here, he taught at Harvard Graduate School of Design, UC Berkeley, the Boston Architectural Center, and the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. A licensed architect, Mark is principal and co-founder of Visible Research Office, a multidisciplinary firm based in San Francisco. He did his practical training in architecture offices in the US and in Switzerland, which shows in the work. And through Visible Research Office, Mark researches new fabrication techniques and innovative materials in their application in the construction process. The work of VRO has received numerous awards and been widely published. And our last speaker is CCA professor Thom Faulders, who's a licensed architect and the founder of Faulders Studio, a multidisciplinary practice that works at the intersection of commissioned architecture, speculative design research, permanent public art installations, and international museum and gallery exhibitions. The multidisciplinary practice believes that the design of today's built environment can be positioned as an open condition, a responsive medium formed in direct exchange with dynamic contextual phenomena and innovative perceptual tactics. Thom is a recipient of many awards, including an Emerging Architect Award from the Architectural League of New York. Faulders Studio projects have been recognized and published internationally, and his work has been acquired into the permanent architecture and design collections at SF MoMA, the Frac Center in Orleans in France, and UC Berkeley Environmental Design Archives. And now I'll pass this over to Ryan and Kristen to kick things off.
All right. Thank you, Keith, for that excellent introduction and for the opportunity to share our work here tonight. It's been really exciting to engage with our colleagues included here tonight on different ways that we approach projects. I'm Kristen Smith.
I'm Ryan Keerns.
And tonight we thought we would share a little bit about our Urban Confluence project in the context of our practice and other projects we've been working on in our office.
The brief for the Urban Confluence Silicon Valley International Design Competition asked for a global iconic landmark that advances humanity in the world's epicenter of innovation. While many of the icons of the 20th century were about mobility and communications, we believe that the icons of the 21st century will necessarily be the result of our attempts to address climate change and provide resilience to enable the continued flourishing of humankind. The ongoing development of forms supporting the current carbon energy flows either hasten their own obsolescence or our own demise. How then can architecture find new postures, organizations, and tectonics that acknowledge a new energy era? Imagine returning nearly 20 square miles of Silicon Valley back into orchards. Arena Respirator attempts to mitigate the worsening effects of climate change through a combination of carbon sequestration and atmospheric removal comparable to a forest of 2 million trees within a 15-acre site.
Ryan and I started our practice together officially in 2017 after working together for almost a decade. We've always looked at architectural competitions as opportunities to test ideas, techniques, and partnerships through architectural constraints. It doesn't bother us if we don't win or receive recognition. It's the practice of continued exploration that keeps us motivated.
The Urban Confluence competition was particularly interesting because it provoked a question that, to us, gets at the fundamental question of what our priorities are as architects. We've been thinking a lot about our roles as architects and how we respond to climate change. No longer is it tenable to suggest that a building for the long term or utilizing increasing amounts of recycled materials is sufficient. A more active approach is needed. Direct air capture is a burgeoning technology that scrubs CO2 from the air to be used for greenhouse growing, fossil fuel alternatives, or can be injected into the ground. By leveraging the attributes of this site, the Arena Respirator orients itself to the predominant wind direction to drive air through the system. Rising on each side of the river, this pairing of a large-scale porous framework visually links the east and west sides of the park, straddling the Guadalupe River.
while providing a framework for CO2 capture and sequestration was one of the driving forces of the work. Another, as you can see from our proposal, was testing and pushing a representational technique that we have been interested in for a while. Inspired both by the work that Ryan had done on the Shrem Museum of Art, as well as the conversations about formal projection that we were having while teaching Studio 2 and Design Media 1, we had been designing with this drawing technique for a few years, asking questions like, what are the minimum number of lines that can be used to convey an idea or a place? How can lines be used to express light, form, material, and atmosphere? We know that representation, or how we draw our ideas, has a huge impact on how we see our work, and therefore how we develop it. For the Urban Confluence competition, we not only wanted to develop the work using line work or hatching as the primary tool, we wanted to tune the technique to work universally, conveying form, atmosphere, and materiality. Lena Kudinar, a then CCA student, joined our office that summer and was pivotal in helping us press these ideas into reality.
Reminiscent of the formal organizations of computer processors and the racks used to hold computer hardware, a readily legible narrative specific to Silicon Valley conveys the uniqueness of this place. Like its inspiration, this framework anticipates technological change while drawing on the grid's immutable presence. Limiting the materials that contributes to further carbon release, Arena Respirator uses a cross-laminated timber structure on a superlative iconic scale.
Important to our work is understanding of tectonic systems and how they can contribute to a building's environmental footprint. A couple of years ago, we were contacted by an emerging company that imagined an approach to building using recycled metal and mass customization robotic framing tools to deliver projects, specifically residential projects, with faster construction times and at a more affordable prices. We partnered with this company on a residential competition based in New York, where we tested their ideas as well as our own collaboration. That partnership continued over the development of several small residential projects, so-called accessory dwelling units or ADUs. In these backyard houses, we were not only using representational techniques to investigate spatial relationships that oscillate between connectivity and privacy, we were also thinking about lines and alignments. These ideas and forms were subsequently co-opted and once again tested in a quick competition for a low-rise, high-density housing in Los Angeles. This proposal draws from a couple of precedents, the Courtyard House and the Terrace House, the projects I was just showing you, to foster community at multiple levels and to build social relationships.
Arena Respirator also builds community by activating the ground and roof levels with publicly available amenities. The ground level imagines public community rooms and commercial spaces that are connected to the exterior plazas that allow activities to spill out into the park. At the roof level, viewing platforms allow for a unique vantage point from which to observe the area and host events.
We've been inspired by the work and words of the Brazilian artist Ligia Pape and her attempts to make positive and negative space that have similar value. For us, especially during the pandemic, as our boundaries between our work and home life began to blur, these ideas suggest thresholds whose porosity feel appropriate to our era, neither modernist, open, or traditionally closed and hierarchical. We've just begun to speculate on the resulting organization of a spatial construction of work and life.
We believe that new architectural paradigms need to be envisioned and explored to both inspire and protect humanity. As we establish an ethic of responsibility and renewal toward the earth and social relations, our work is an attempt to discover a coherent set of principles that may help define this new paradigm. Thank you, Keith, for the invitation to speak about our work and our ideas. And now we'll hand it off to our friend, Clark Thenhaus.
Okay, okay, great. Thanks, Ryan and Kristen, for getting us started. And of course, thanks to Keith and the CCA Architecture Division for the invitation. I'll go ahead and pull up my screen share here. All right, so we were invited to as we were on scaffold as well to discuss the competition, to talk about it tonight, as well as how it relates to our broader practice and pedagogies at CCA. So the game plan will be first to sort of introduce a broader method of working and approach, and I'll conclude with the actual competition proposal. I'll begin with this image. This is a still from Buster Keaton's film, 1 Week. This image for me is emblematic of, I guess, a preferred way to think about architecture. What I mean by that is that we can tell there's a legibility to this image that this is a house, yet there's also things that have gone awry. The roof is misoriented, the porch is askew, the windows are misaligned. So there's something about the elements in this house, the parts within the whole, that provides or produces a kind of character defining description of the house, or character defining principles. So for me, this creates a kind of quality that I would call almost familiar. Things are familiar in their parts, but maybe not so much as a whole, though it's still legible as a whole. So this will be the only reading that I'll have in the lecture. So to take this a step further, this is my claim, that there are certain architectural forms and elements that are beloved by both architects and broader cultures alike. I call these darlings because this genre of forms exhibits both disciplinary and extradisciplinary endearment. Darlings are extradisciplinarily endeared as evidenced by their cultural comforts and encoding into political policies such as planning and preservation codes. And they are architecturally endeared as evidenced by successive generations of architects revisiting them as sources for disciplinary imagination. So an abbreviated list of these would include things like bay or picture windows, gable roofs, chimneys, columns, dormers, porches, domes, which I'll talk about tonight, arches, turrets, and so forth, are things that are character defining parts within a whole, which is distinct from maybe a more conventional or traditional way of thinking about typology, which has more to do with program, so, you know, multifamily, so forth. So this plays out in a variety of ways in the practice and in teaching. For example, here in looking at planning and preservation codes in San Francisco, which produce both geometric and proportional material limitations or regulations on forms like turrets and bay windows, and sort of leveraging those or abstracting those or using those to create, in this case, a gallery installation of between 8 and 12 foot tall turrets that kind of reconstruct a streetscape, so to speak, within the context of the gallery, and which pervert those planning and preservation codes to new ends, or taking that even a step further and cutting and pasting diagrams from the preservation code into a complete plan. So here again, parts become composed into a whole, and translating that through elevation to create a new expression out of those regulations embedded in the planning and preservation code. Maybe taking this even a step further into a kind of critical satire, perhaps I'd call it, of a drawing. This was a drawing actually produced for an exhibition at CCA curated by Adam Marcus and former faculty Andrew Cudlis. And in other cases, these manipulations within the practice play out in, for example, in this case, this is a farmhouse project in Colorado, where the manipulations are to a porch and a chimney to sort of abstract or defamiliarize those elements. In this case, to sort of move away from the traditional frontality of a farmhouse. In other cases, something like the bay window, and sort of inverting that bay window, or in this case, also the scupper, where the scupper becomes so exaggerated that it actually sort of peels through the wall and directs water into embedded cisterns for water collection. In other cases, this ranch house pop-top renovation in Denver, where the gable roof simultaneously reads as a kind of gable roof form, yet it also reads as a cut or carved mass, punctuated by, again, a scoop porch and a inverted picture window. So, while there are these kind of underlying techniques of abstraction or exaggeration or perversion to familiar elements, you might also notice that there's a kind of formal, sensibility in the work, or an interest in Platonic solids and geometric primitives. And this really comes from an interest in a kind of obscure drawing series from Louis Mondet called Some Penetrations of Solids. And what I find interesting about these drawings is the geometry and the mathematics interesting for one, but actually more interesting to me is how we can name each part. So if we look at figure 210, we can say there's a cone and there's two cylinders, but we don't have a vocabulary for the whole. We can only make associations out of it. We can't really apply names. We could say it looks like antennas or something. And so that for me is a way to kind of open up and produce new associations of familiar things. So some work takes that on quite literally in producing or sort of reproducing some of those drawings in built form or model form. In other cases, sort of deforming them in these little 3D printed models as a way of sort of, I don't know, testing or identifying the limits to which the legibility of that geometric primitive is maintained or lost. And then that also becomes a way of working through projects as well. This was a competition proposal for a music hall in San Francisco, again, where you see an aggregation of cones and cylinders in which the cylinders are cut with these kind of like Gothic arches to reveal a cube embedded within them. And maybe more directly towards the competition proposal, a series of dome projects. In this case, this was a project for the League Prize in 2015 called a Project for Domes, in which historic domes were actually recomposed using only spheres, cones, and cylinders, producing this kind of abstraction, and in which surrealist techniques of sort of combining things that don't maybe necessarily properly belong together, like the American Prairie and a gilded dome, produce new associations or strange meanings. In this case, each dome was a marker for one of the middles of America. This led to a series of other dome projects. This one, or these two, I should say, were at the invitation of Golden Voices for potential build at Coachella Music Festival in Southern California, where here and an important part of this is underfoot of the dome. So again, the dome is most often a kind of part, a signifying part in most buildings. And so here, the removal of that institutional underfoot produces new associations and new capacities for the dome, in this case, to convene a kind of social sort of concert party atmosphere. So when it came to the competition, similar to how Ryan and Kristen were talking about it, it was maybe not an explicit desire to win, but maybe more that the competition provided a venue or an avenue to think about scaling some of this work up or positioning it in different ways. And so this was actually a little model for a different dome that was to be in LA. And so geometrically, what's happening in this is it's just taking the kind of conventional octafoil or four-lobed dome and creating a rotation to make an octafoil or a quatrefoil dome, which is four lobes, rotating it to create an octafoil dome. And in doing that, the competition then sought to sort of scale up the dome from being something that was previously sort of ceiling-like or covered-like or pavilion-like to being something that was larger and fully spatially occupiable. Again, thinking about that kind of surrealist technique of this dome, so to speak, where there's a sort of strangeness about the relationship between the two, yet there's a sort of purposefulness to that. And this is, I think, enhanced or exaggerated by the coloration of the dome. In this case, sort of leveraging the sort of cultural history of wood shingles in the Bay Area, and sort of swerving that towards new media and technology, in this case through coloration and patination of different metals, as well as this kind of like solar films that are embedded into them. You see here in section how you can kind of move under, up, and through the dome, eventually sort of ascending along this ramp to the sky deck. Here seen sort of at the Belvedere level, and then on the left at that sky deck level. And so in this competition, is there really, again, a sort of claim for darlings, as I call them, as a sort of part within a whole, in this case, only a part, to become the actual sort of entirety of the project, with the idea that by working on the sort of legibility of these familiar things, there's a sort of explicit intention to shift the arc of attention or to shift the arc of spatial and contextual experience, while simultaneously working within inherited codes or conventions or building categorizations or legibilities that often condition expectation. With that, I'm at 10 minutes exactly. I will pass it over to, I believe Mark Donohue is next. Thank you.
All right, so I'll start. So thanks, Clark, for being on time, and Kristen and Ryan as well. And thanks also, Keith, for inviting us to talk about our work. This is great. And I'm hoping we will have time at the end to talk more about teaching and how we're interacting with one another. I'd like to start though. I'll read a portion of my text as well. And I think I'm going to use a similar trajectory that Clark did, where give some sort of a context for things and then kind of work through some of the projects that led up to ultimately the piece that we did for the competition. I also would like to thank Kyle Matlock, who worked on the project with me. He's a CCA undergrad student. So once again, using CCA, the power of CCA. All right, so to begin, I like to ask questions through the work I do. Questions of space, form, structure, light, and geometry seem to persist as lines of inquiry in my work. Through my office, I make my research visible, so hence the name, right? So with that, being an architect and educator gives me a chance to explore these themes with a diverse set of collaborators who are equally obsessed with making things. That would be you folks here at CCA. So I want to note our actually logo for the school here and highlight the terms theory and practice, because I think we all try and do that with all the work that we do. And I think actually CCA is a unique place in that we are all the faculty working as well as trying to teach. And so that's this combination that I'm really interested in and why I think I found a home here at CCA. And after Keith had mentioned the number of schools that I've taught at, finally I found my home at CCA. So I would also like to talk about the importance of drawing. I think it's a theme, seems to be evidence that the past two sets of people's work. So drawings are fundamental to what I do as an architect. You can go, in fact, so far as to say drawing is my practice, drawing lines to turn ideas into three-dimensional form. So I would say that, architects do a lot of things, but I think drawing is still fundamental to the way we communicate and actually construct things. It's something that I talk with my students about, and I think I find myself doing more of that than all the other jobs architects potentially do. But this idea of drawing so central is actually something that I've thought a lot about. In fact, actually, as an undergrad, that's something I did by hand a lot, drawing by hand back in the day. And then it's really when I went to grad school that I actually started to think more about working digitally. And in fact, I think that's where, for me, it started in a way, thinking more of the meta ideas of architecture. I was an avid reader of the AA files back in the day. And in particular, I love the writing of Robin Evans. So when I had it in my mind that I wanted to go to graduate school, I knew that he was teaching at the GSD as a visiting professor. So I said, I'm gonna make it happen. I'm gonna go there. So I managed to apply, got in, and lo and behold, I arrived in the fall of 1993, and he had just passed away. So I was like, oh, I had my opportunity, but it went away. So in fact, what I did find, though, is a culture at the GSD where they talked a lot about his writings. In particular, these two books or either one had just come out in 1995 and the other one came out in 1997, but they sort of summarized the writings that he had been doing over the years. And as you all might know, is that there is a clear relationship between him and for him, drawing is central and actually influences architecture to a great degree. So the means of representation and how we did it. And I'd say that I think I'm of a generation where drawing by hand and then drawing digitally and now doing a little bit of both is something that I think influences the way I work and make and do things. And that's something is still central to what I do and central, I think, to what we do as architects. So in a way, I think the work I'm doing is kind of a continuing dialogue with him, even though he's passed away, Robin Evans, and the readings that I did of his work and understanding the importance of his articles. And in a way, it's kind of all these projects are kind of odes to him. So jump into that a little bit more. This is an image from the projective cast. It's called, in a particular article called Drawn Stone. It's by this author A.F. Rizier, but it's of an actual building that was built in 1719. in France. What I like so much about it is it sort of brings together the kind of qualities. It sort of centralizes the role that drawing plays and stereotomy plays, and actually constructing and making this stair. I would have added an image of the construction stair, but I thought we were limited to slides. So just imagine in your minds, this all actually was built. But the staircase is actually spectacular, and it kind of seems to float through space, even though it's all made out of carved stone. And so there's something really about that, being able to sort of draw or delineate the making of materials and then constructing it to actually have this incredible spatial effect. It's something that it just resonates with me. The other thing is maybe these two characters, Gaspard Monge, and the person who followed up after him was Theodore Olivier. And in particular, Monge, we might not know much about, but we certainly, as architects, use all the things that he's worked on. He could be considered the grandfather, as it were, of a descriptive geometry. So it's the way we work today in plan, section, and elevation, and actually describing an object we're going to be building is something that they did a lot of. In fact, he helped sort of codify all that way of actually working. In particular, it was for people that were making mechanical devices and machines. And actually, that's where Olivier sort of picked it up and sort of ran with the ball. Both of these folks did a lot of teaching and were part and parcel in training a number of people that were engineers and makers of usually mechanisms and different farming devices and such. But the geometries that they had to do to actually understand them became sort of their sort of cause. So this is actually a plate on the left-hand side of from Monge's book on descriptive geometry from 1811, talking about the intersection of cylinders. And on the right is the kind of 3D version of it that Olivier had done, but it's actually a string model, really. And it shows, because it's actually operable, it's interactive. It shows how that intersection can change if you change the shape of the cylinders and their angles and such. So so both drawing and also making the drawing actually became quite important to me. So I'm going to jump into my work, sort of fast forward. Mark, I don't know what year I did this. Keith, I think I was doing these installations at CCA a couple of summers ago, pre-COVID. But this is literally a drawing I was doing.
2019.
There you go. So fairly recent work. And what it was is understanding sort of translating drawings, which, a gray pencil line on a wall, more like a mural, but pulling those lines into space, literally. So these are actually yarn drawings, string drawings, that are both descriptive of, let's say, cylinders and cones, but also bringing them through space to transpose with one another, have discourse with one another. If you could see them, if I could end on the slide, you'd see that they're actually three-dimensional. They actually are quite interesting. So this is one of over 70 drawings / murals / objects that I created over the course of one summer, just to sort of explore that idea a little bit more fully. So this might be sort of more of the sort of research end of things, which influenced and also was influenced by this piece I had done when I was at Autodesk as a artist in residence program there. But this was a suspended helical stair, which sort of picks up on this idea. If what we were looking at before was line as space maker, this starts to become line as structure. So I was quite literally exploring geometries and the sort of lineaments of geometries, wireframe diagrams, and so to speak, but actually making the wires into literally wires, or cables in this case, to suspend the stair. So it was actually looking at trying to make that the kind of force vector lines tangible and visible, so you can actually move around in and around and see it. And so this is kind of an exploration of that. There's a bunch of models that preceded it, a bunch of other studies that sort of followed it, but it was kind of an ode to the ruled surface, looking at helicoid and helical stairs, and trying to understand how these nested geometries can actually create really intriguing spaces, but also a real demonstration of how the structure works. I actually worked with Steve Ratchey. He's a faculty member here teaching structures, but he's also a VP at Thornton Tomasetti, and helped me develop this more fully, and actually blew my mind when he said, Mark, you can't make the stair light, you have to make it super heavy. And in fact, these cables, you need more of them. So I love the guy. So it all totally worked out in the end. I finally found up with this. So I have to find a place to actually put it. So part of that was actually coming up with an idea of how to then sort of create an instance of it, an instantiation of it, sort of proof of the pudding. And I created a sort of fictive story for myself that a series of museums around the United States were frustrated with the staircases that they had, and they needed a new staircase. And so I did this one. This is at, imagine what this would look like, the suspended helical stair at Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum in New York. But I also imagined one at the Yale British Art Museum by Luke Hahn, but also one here in San Francisco, which I think we really do need a new staircase because I'm not quite happy with Snowetta's version. In fact, I was a little bit happier with Boda's. I don't know about you folks, but I think Boda actually had it over Snowetta. But when they see my stair, the board at SF MoMA is just going to hire me instantaneously to actually build one. So hopefully at SF MoMA, they'll have one of these suspended helical stairs coming up soon. Who knows? So another thing I did too when I was at Autodesk was actually explored line as a toolpath. I think if you all know what water jet tools, this is I had a chance to actually work with Autodesk's sort of fantastic equipment that they've got, these sort of high octane 3D milling machines, etc. And in this case, it was the OMAX water jet, and actually realized that it's very good at cutting lines, straight lines, but I managed to find a way to hack it so it actually would create angled lines and actually use it, and actually by moving the head and also the bed to actually create these oval shapes. So it was actually straight lines, ruled surfaces once again, but cutting through stone, cutting through marble. Maybe this is once again my ode to Robin Evans and drawn stone, and that earlier piece that I'd shown you folks. But in this case, it was actually creating a series of these elements which then could be stacked to ultimately create a tower. And in this case, it's actually a very simple looking shape, but can be recombined in a variety of different ways. These were definitely the precursors then for the piece that followed, which was my entry for the competition. So I was looking at lines of force, understanding that it has to resolve itself in particular ways. But my project, the proposal for the competition that we did down in Silicon Valley was called Twist Light Tower. And it was literally a tower similar to, I guess, what possibly Ryan and Kristen were doing, and possibly what Clark was doing as well, where you go up to the very top and from there you actually can look around. But it was trying to resolve the geometry of the primary view, which is of downtown, which is at one angle, versus the ground plane, which is trying to reorient itself towards the surrounding urban block and the park. So that kind of resolution of the two caused the twist, or that's the story I'm telling myself these days. And then ultimately, though, we're trying to resolve it too using particular materials. In this case, it was wood, both as an exterior, as a wood lath, but also interior. It's actually the structure of the building, as it's all done out of CLT panels and heavy timber construction, but also a good bit of steel to actually hold it up. So it was the exploration of those. There's some images of that ultimate proposal for the tower itself. And more importantly is actually what the experience would be like. And in this case, it was a stair. I think you got a theme that I like to pick up on at this point. So it's a spiral stair, using the idea that actually, two means of egress are required out of most buildings. So this is actually a double spiral stair going up to the very, very top. But it's also helping to sort of animate the experience of actually going in and around and through the building. So there's an elevator core at the middle, but as the spiral stair around the perimeter, and then the observation deck, 2 observation decks, in fact, on top. And the way I was getting into the museum was actually using sort of a ramp that would lead you down to the bottom, but primarily as a way to talk about, let's say, the building that had preceded this, the electric light tower that was in San Jose, but also its electric light tower's relationship to the Eiffel Tower and a bunch of other interesting towers that were done back in the day, that this is kind of an ode to of sorts. This is more of a drawing of what the construction was like. The idea being that it would be these elements that could be stacked one on top of the other once they've been constructed, and then just create the tower out of itself. So some of the limitation factors were how high a crane could lift each one of these and what the weight of each one of these pieces were, so it actually could be constructed. Try to take that quite seriously, and actually try and do it with some degree of efficiency of materials as well. And in the end, that's the floor plans. And the idea also is that as you look at it from all these different orientations, that as you move around at it as a visitor to the site, and also as a person who walks around the city, the tower would appear differently from different orientations. So that's another reason why the twist actually worked in a kind of an interesting way, that it actually had these different kind of readings depending upon where you were. And last but not least, the view, the poster view of the project at night, lighting up as a lantern, glowing lantern. Because as part of the brief, as I recall, one of the issues was making sure, since it's so close to the airport, that it didn't light up in a way that it would induce planes to try and land on it. So this was my attempt to actually be both revelatory about the lighting up of the project, but also make sure that it doesn't look like a landing strip. So, and I think with that, I think I'll end it and pass it on to Thom.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here today. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to start off showing a few other projects as a lead in to the competition project. And specifically, I want to talk about ideas tonight where we as architects can use minimal means to achieve maximum results. So I'll open with a couple of other projects, as I've mentioned. This first one is for a facade design in Miami, where essentially we created 1,500 flat drawings in metal, seen here, each one about 11 feet long. And these are individual patterns. Each one is unique. And here you can see them coming out of large ovens where the paint has been baked onto them. Each drawing or panel is cut into rectangular sheets and then was painted, as we just saw, and then packed for shipping and installation. All of these sheets, in addition to 1,400 uniquely hand-bent and welded fins that we see on the left, were designed to wrap this new 8-story building, which of course we can see on the right here. Made from perforated aluminum by design and by intention, the entire surface is as flat and as smooth as a piece of paper. The only thing that protrudes outward are these hand-formed fins from the smoothness, and they're used there to accentuate the perforated patterns. So here's a completed building photograph. Given the scope and scale of the facade, the thinness of the envelope is still able to alter our perception of the overall volume. And optically, it recalibrates the enormous mass, which in effect more readily syncs with this gritty art neighborhood, this part of a district called Wynwood in Miami. So I like to think of this, as I started off with, as a very large drawing that can be experienced on both sides. So now we're seeing it from the inside. And part of this project is a parking garage. So no matter where you park, every spot kind of has a unique kind of connection to the overall figure. And once added up, it's essentially a 43,000 square foot facade, which now starts to become and is a new addition to the city of Miami. Another project that's much smaller is called Shapeshift Oakland. And here I conceived it as one continuous line. First, though, in order to fabricate it, it's broken up into individual fragments for production. Then we can see here it's reconstituted into 20-foot modules. And then finally, it's back on site where it is craned onto the face of this new hotel in downtown Oakland. It's called Moxie. And it is at the corner of Grand and Telegraph. So as we see it completed here, the piece can be experienced. Now it's been reconstituted and we can see it as one continuous line. Yet with the adjacent line striping and all of the urban graphics in the neighborhood, it blends, it stands out, but it also blends into its surroundings quite comfortably. Within the pattern is embedded an outline of the city of Oakland, and this intentionally adds a visual urban marker to this eclectic part of Oakland. part of the city. And one other project that I'm going to show, which has a lot of what we're trying to do, which is to achieve surprising and almost sometimes for us unexpected outcomes, relying on really reductive tectonic and material menus or processes or techniques. So put another way, as I've already introduced, how can we achieve exuberance or even excess using reductive strategies? So in this case, only rope. I was working on this particular canopy project for Google while I was working on the Confluence Silicon Valley competition, which will be evident in a minute. This is called Earth's Pull, and we used 1.5 miles of really thick, 1.5 inch thick rope to create an overhead shade canopy. And using the downward force of gravity as a literal form finder in this case, right? So the gravity is pulling the catenary curves into place. Earth's Pull by design invites occupants to take notice not only what's overhead, but possibly to take notice of the presence of gravity in the world beneath our feet. The ropes are always swinging in the wind, and when you're there, it feels like a very large, comfortable blue water drop, just kind of like pulsating overhead. It's quite simple and yet effective. Okay, so now onto the competition. While I was doing this work, I was living in Stockholm for part of this, and I had set up a design collaboration with a small team of architects and collaborators at a company known as White Architecture. They're the largest architecture firm in Scandinavia, and they're the 3rd largest firm in Europe. Here you see in the image their headquarters in Stockholm. And since this was an open-ended call for project, and similar to the other projects that we've seen tonight that the others have presented, we decided to use this brief as a platform for ideas. So in red, you can see the primary design team members, both here with Faulders Studio and also from White Architecture, and then a larger kind of team of consultants that we used. So just quickly, a little bit of context here for the project. The size of the proposed expansion, which is adjacent to the park, is pretty mind-blowing in scope and scale. It's called Google's Transit Village, sorry. And it's expected that up to 25,000 people will be living there within the next 10 years. So this is kind of a massive shift in the core of San Jose. And so we modeled some of the expected architectural growth. And we can see how the site functions as a kind of downward trough resting between the two architectural cores, the original downtown off to the right and the new transit village off to the left. And though the competition brief was pointing towards the idea of a singular icon, possibly a tower, we proposed to do something quite the opposite in an effort to challenge essentially the sponsor's assumptions. But I guess since we're presenting tonight and we didn't move forward on the competition, perhaps challenging authority doesn't always work out. But you can see what they were essentially asking for in the brief and our reply, which was in many ways to do the opposite, not just to create problems, but to create a set of ideas. So keeping in mind this future urban density, our idea is to create an overhead surface that would define a single outdoor room to be used by the city's occupants. And resonating with the primary product coming out of Silicon Valley, that of the network, we thought it could exist like any network, ever present and open-ended. Mark Cousins, in a text called The Ugly, writes that a sublime space, quote, seems to have no limit and no proportion. The sublime is neither an image nor an object of particular type, but the enactment of a scene in which the subject and the object have a dynamic relation to each other within a specific setting. So here's some preliminary sketches that we did. Here's a site plan, so you get the scope of what we were doing, much larger than SAP Center off to the left. And we like the idea of creating something that slumped downward rather than being upright and singular. So we let the site pressures determine the form. So here it dips down in response to the adjacent airport flight path, which is very, very close. And you see the airplanes just coming right down. It's pretty cool. It pushes up towards the building cores at either side. We made a void at the river's confluence in the center there and rounded the edges to accept the primary pedestrian flows. The author Barry Lopez, in describing the Arctic, which of course is a very different place than San Jose, writes, quote, "The physical landscape is baffling in its ability to transcend whatever we would make of it. It is larger than our grasp, yet somehow it is still knowable. So could we propose a scale of building that is conceived as a single object, yet could extend beyond our perceptual reach?" That was the question we had for this. So we decided to create a valley within the valley. Clever, right? By tapping into the region's unprecedented way of doing things differently, our proposal, named Skylight, spans a massive 14 acres of land and reaches to heights of 150 feet at either end. It's entirely open air and it's wafer thin and frames the ground, the vegetation, the waterways of the park, and really acts as an intermediary between ourselves, the ground, and the sky. To experience Skylight is to be immersed into an architectural valley of the sublime, made more strange by being located right next to San Jose. Here you see the timber supports, lightweight lattice, landscape plan. Reconceived, as I said, as an outdoor room, the park is outlined overhead by voids. The park is currently entirely nondescript, but just by putting this mesh over it, completely transforms it. It's constructed primarily in timber, the only carbon neutral and renewable building material we know of today. Captures solar energy during the day and punctuates the nighttime sky with downward lighting. We even calculated the photovoltaic output. And we got kind of obsessed. I'm just about done here. Even though it's a speculative project, we're even choosing the colors of PV panels here. And yes, you can see in the image there, you can even get pink or bright green PV. It's pretty cool. It's immense in size, and yet it's configured to the human scale. This is the final image here. I began with our Wynwood project and described the effects that thinness can achieve. And I think it's something that resonates and something we were interested in with this project as well. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Sarah, maybe we can go to I guess it's just me, go to a grid view, gallery view. Thank you all so much. That was really wonderful to see. And in some ways makes the obvious question that I may have had kind of irrelevant, which is, like, let's talk about like the thread that connects sort of ongoing ideas and practice to instances of practice. Because you also clearly demonstrated that, I think, in really interesting ways. But maybe we can then link back to the other line of conversation that we wanted to have is how research and practice as architects in the world, both engaged in commissioned work, but also pursuing speculative opportunities through competitions like this, which are almost always losing propositions, right? It doesn't matter. I feel like you actually have a better chance if you're contrary than if you're obedient in some ways, because the obedient projects tend to all manifest the same concept that the brief is premised upon. And the disobedient projects reveal something that's not necessarily evident to those who are crafting the brief. If you have a strong jury, I suppose. Sometimes the money that crafts briefs, maybe if it's Google money too, once their vision manifested, regardless of what other ideas might prove it to be less than prudent. Anyway. But the other thread that we wanted to address tonight was your work as educators, and how your research and your practice connect to your pedagogical practices here at the college. And I think in important ways, particularly for a school of our size, with the history that we have of a kind of collegial communicative faculty, as much as COVID might have, put some like severe ruptures in that fabric. Maybe if you could each, and I guess it's not quite a fair question, but that's okay. Maybe speak to that next step, right? Like how do you bring your work into your teaching? While recognizing, and I think this is really a beautiful thing about CCA too, that an academic studio is not simply a platform to further promote your own specific agenda, right? You're part of a community here. And I would leave that like whoever wants to speak first.
I could jump in. For me, it's actually pretty direct, because the particular classes that I'm teaching, once upon a time was DM1, where literally teaching students how to draw. And so that was something that was specifically tied to the way I've been working and understanding and the kind of the problem of architecture, one of the problems of architecture. But also, I would say in the more recently, it's actually been more in the building technology courses. So I've been teaching materials and methods, and also in the integrated building design studios, or what we call integrated studios now, where it's about how do you take those ideas and actually, work them out and figure out the tectonics, how you actually put it together. So I would say that those are themes that I think I've always been interested in, and actually have been trying to explore through the work I do on my own, but it's also been fun to work with the students to help push those even further. So I think that that's where the working with the students has enabled a way of like looking at and inquiring about things, and also having students quite literally working on them with me on a vast number of the projects. Once upon a time, I did some installation pieces too, and exploring similar ideas that Thom was pulling up. And I find that those are also other moments where you could actually explore them with a larger community, because once again, it was usually a bunch of students working with me, and we're using the equipment I've found at CCA, the CNC milling machines, and such. And also even working with, as I mentioned, Steve Rauchi, the structural engineer. So there are things that I've been leveraging and using and actually bringing into the work in order to get it done. But it's a way of sort of turning it around and actually having a larger set of eyes on the project as well, and seeing if it actually can be done. Things can be tested, and actually been for me really rewarding because of that, because I've been involved with the school. I can't imagine having done any of these projects on my own. That's where I think the school and being able to teach and actually being able to work with students has actually promoted so much.
I mean, I guess that's the flip side, is actually how does the school actually bend your research or inform your practice too, both your colleagues but also your students.
Yeah, I would echo Mark's comments about teaching, and really it's been the teaching of DM1 that's been very influential in our practice as we think about drawing conventions, and we're of an era where doing really slick computer renderings was very natural. And so going back and looking at drawing, and specifically spending a lot of time looking at Paul Rudolph drawings, has been really influential to us, and as a way of kind of differentiating our practice and thinking about ways of representation that are against the current grain of what is typically seen.
I would expand that just to say that, I've been teaching at CCA for longer than we've had our practice. One of the things that I find so, I guess, partly we're a partnership because I do better with constant conversation, constant feedback. And being an adjunct professor at CCA, where I only have to teach a couple of classes a year as they come available, or as I'm available, has provided those touch points for constant feedback and just refreshing, we give a little bit and we get so much more back from those conversations that we have with students that it's constantly refreshing what it is that we're talking about and how we're working in the studio.
You know, CCA is a really unique place in that we're an art and design and, you know, writing, and sorry, I got to stop this. Sorry about that. And yet, so you might think it's doesn't really have it's kind of like an arm, or it's not tapped into day-to-day practice. And yet we're really unique in that the professors and really the vibe at the school and the students are interested in this. It's both experimental, but there's a lot of real world know-how, right? And there's a willingness to not only embrace theory, but also how to realize that and how to make it happen. And part of that has to do with being in an urban environment. And, you know, there's kind of a lot of talent that we're surrounded by, but certainly it's fostered, and there's kind of a stewardship and an identity at a place like CCA that is interested in both, like extreme experimentation, but also figure out how to do it when necessary, and if it applies and if it's applicable. And I think that's unique, right? We're not needing to be on one side or the other, but we can really engage with the entire kind of world of architecture that way. So I think that's a great attribute that we have here in the institution organization here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with all of those sentiments as well. I might only add that in my case, you know, by looking to what we might call the familiar, it opens up a range of opportunities and territories for people to bring and come to any class with their own sort of personal histories and subjectivities that then sort of get intermixed with disciplinary techniques and histories and theories. And so, you know, it's a way of you know, both understanding your own literal local neighborhood or personal history in relationship to how we might think about reshaping or reimagining architecture and its capacities.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point too, Clark, and it's certainly something that is just increasingly relevant. You know, the histories of the discipline have tended to narrow attention, and I think an expansive attention is something we're seeing more and more of. And I think that attitude towards, let's say, an architectural frame of mind brought to a kind of seeing of the familiar, right? A kind of reconsideration of one's environment, particularly for a young student of architecture, you know. Whereas typically, I mean, we are probably all even of slightly different generations, whereas like, okay, you just ignore all that stuff that you lived the last 20 years of your life, 18, whatever, and here's the world again, right? And so it's nice to know that, you know, like that's not what we want to do anymore. Also, I think these comments lead in. Heather left a comment in the chat, and I don't know, Heather, Hannah, excuse me. I can either read, Hannah, your question, or you can ask it if you unmute yourself. Okay, I'll go ahead and read Hannah's question, although you can all see it yourselves, but I think it's important to read it for the audience. I see the interest that each of you, won't let her unmute, let them unmute. I see the interest that each of you are exploring in your body of work, and I'm interested to know at what point in your career did each of you start to narrow your interest in order to push and innovate toward particular ideas or areas of the discourse, as well as how do you start to narrow a focus, and how do you start to begin to explore that or materialize it, especially as someone just starting their career? I think that's such a great question, right? Like, how do you, you know, as an individual begin to actually like tend to specific areas of research? And I'll add maybe like, and how do you not agonize about the things that you left behind?
Well, I think for me, what's interesting is I think a lot of the work I was showing is stuff that I've been doing more recently. By recently mean the last 2 to maybe 4 years. Interesting. I think I feel like I had to work through a lot of other things to get to where I'm at. And maybe that's even just listening to myself and my inner voice and trusting it by the time I'm now, in my 50s. And I'd say that that's where, having worked through a number of different environments too, having worked at very large offices, I worked at Gensler for a number of years, and working at very small practices like Mark Mack, another Bay Area architect, and other firms in both the United States, over in Europe, and in Switzerland. It was through a variety of experiences that I kind of found my way to this. But I think it's a process, I would say. I think you folks, I'm thinking Tom, I'm thinking Clark, I'm thinking Kristen and Ryan, I think you all might have started on that path a little earlier. You seem to have such strong work, and it's been that way for a while. But I feel like for me, it took getting through a lot of those other experiences to finally wind up where I'm at. And I would say that, so I would say, don't worry, you'll get there. Just keep listening to your inner voice would be my little line. If I could, I'll just bow out of.
Yeah, I would say I don't know that. I think maybe while it looks like we've kind of narrowed focus in some regards and how we presented our work tonight, I would say there's certainly interests that we bring, that we kind of continue. We always have similar questions that we bring to things, but I would also say that those questions that we ask ourselves through our work may have a certain lifespan and kind of changes over time. And we just are not seeing that kind of longer term period in this particular presentation. So I don't feel like, I personally don't feel like we're narrowed at all in scope. I don't know if I'll ever feel like we're narrowed exactly in what it is we're looking at. Mainly because back to Keith's question about how do you not think about all of those other things that you're not paying attention to? We're constantly asking well, what about this? What about this other thing? And there is an editing as we move through a project that has to take place, but generally we pick up those other questions as we move forward into the next project. So it's more of a filtered, where little, you try to kind of push things forward in a way that's productive for you in certain thing, but then the droppings from that project or from those questions that go unanswered in one thing kind of move on to the next thing, and they just kind of build as we go.
Yeah, I also feel like I kind of agonize over the lack of focus or lack of coherence. I feel like we have a certain degree of eclecticism present in our work, and I think that's okay. I think there's a degree of I would frame it as versatility to address multiple different types of problems. Yes, with similar attitudes, but not necessarily with the same tool.
Yeah, and those attitudes are just our voices that have come, have built up through time. That's just our perspectives on things. And so finding that perspective, and I think Mark, you said this too, finding that perspective, listening to your inner voice is what begins to guide you to have these kind of developments on the same kind of theme, or the narrowing maybe that you're seeing.
It's a really interesting question, because I'm not sure, at what point, I'm not really sure at what point it was, or if I've even reached that point yet or not. I think maybe just more generally, it's kind of just what fascinates you, and what can sustain that fascination. And I think, and I hope, we're at a point in the field and the discipline where new voices are so welcome and new ideas are so welcome that just sustaining that interest and finding different avenues and venues and people to communicate and explore those ideas with, in a way, it'll find you, right? The point will somehow find you more than you find the point. So yeah, I guess like I don't know. I love the question. I guess it seems like whatever fascinates you, I think is available territory to bring into the field of architecture. And you know, I mean, in my case, like there's like 3 dome projects I didn't show. You know, they all sort of go together. They kind of disconnect for a couple years and then come back. You know, and I just think whatever, and the broader topic of legibility is just sort of like how do I look at these buildings that are sort of prosaic and I don't, you know, they're not around in books, and then, you know, I was interested in, you know, simple geometries, and like those things just sort of over time I think tend to kind of accrue and aggregate in your mind and splinter in different directions. And I mean, I think it's exciting that the field is opening up to those voices and ideas. And so yeah, like, you know, to your last point about someone just starting their career, I think pursue whatever fascinates you, and I think that there's available territory in the field for it.
Actually, that just reminded me as like of a, you know, of my inner voice from when I was a student. I went to a school, I would say different from CCA in that there was so much focus on everyone in the school kind of producing similar work, or there were some very, very strong voices in everyone was kind of doing the research of those strong voices and kind of pushing those ideas through, or at least, you know, that's how I felt at the time. And I really enjoyed it because there was just so much, you know, exciting work happening. But it took a long time for me to find those things of, you know, that were my own, that I was interested in to kind of take from what I had learned in school. Because so I do think that there is, maybe not for everybody, but I do think that there is a moment where you're in school, you're kind of soaking everything in, all the different viewpoints of other people, your colleagues, the students in your cohort, and also professors, just the city, everything, you know, you're soaking it all in, and it takes a kind of processing time to feel like, oh, this is something I'm really passionate about. I keep asking these questions, and you begin to develop that.
I think that's such great observations. I mean, I'm thinking just particularly Ryan and Kristen with like the line, like you got obsessed with lines. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I would imagine you probably went back and redrew some projects with this new technique just to sort of understand like old work, perhaps. But, you know, that, you know, is that a narrowed focus, or does that kind of concern with the particular means of representation, a technique, a method, begin to provide you with, in fact, a fresh way of looking at old problems, right? So it's not necessarily like, that's the goal. It's actually the application of a method that affords new results, right? Or a new way of achieving results. And I think in all of your work, we do clearly see how attitudes toward representation manifest themselves first, I think, in a way of like seeing the world somewhat differently, or, you know, from a different perspective. Imagining then how architecture might be produced within that representational framework, or like not necessarily within, but as informed by. And then in every case, actually, how does that representational technique manifest itself through material techniques to produce things, stuff in the world, like literally put matter into the world, then reorganizes at least that little spot. Which I think also speaks to something we see sort of clearly within the kind of practice, the pedagogical practices at the college, you know, which is a kind of place that's centered on making in its whole history as a kind of craft institution. But, you know, there is a necessary step in making, which is actually envisioning, you know, and that's the sort of the drawing, the digital modeling, whatever it is. So we have a comment from Tina, who can't unmute because they're in a noisy room, but thank you for showing such insightful design. Tina collaborated with coworkers for this very competition, and hearing your thinking process gives them a completely new understanding of the work that they did. They're curious to hear how you decided on the scale of your designs. This might be a good one for you to take the lead on, Thom, since you like went big, and the detailed development process for the work. So maybe that also keys into this conversation of how like drawing becomes building.
Well, it just seemed like it was a call for big ideas. And again, we didn't go big just to make a big idea, but as I presented quickly, it's kind of an amazing, or will be an amazing urban setting there. So we really wanted to take that on. I really see our proposal not as a thing, but really as kind of an urban project. And so we just how we, to address that question, it was just reframing the problem, right? That seemed to be appropriate for, our particular take on this thing. We thought, it needs to take on as much as possible. So we didn't know what that would mean, right? Probably for everybody here, and that's what's kind of crazy with these talks, is like we show up at the end of the day and here's what we did, but that doesn't mean that's where we started, right? And it's a process, and it's a lot of like terrible ideas that just get out there and you throw them away and you try new ones. And it's a kind of this thing that we talk about all the time in studio, this iterative process, right? I always think it's like, looking for cool rocks on the beach or something. Like you're trying to find something. When you find it, but you've got to look, right? You've got to take a look. You've got to like go there and start drawing and try things out, and then realize when you should basically throw something away and try a new one. So that really is, for me anyway, is embedded into that scale question. It didn't start off like, this is exactly what we should do, but it starts to make sense as you kind of pursue what you think could make sense.
Similarly to, I think I flashed my screen share there if you saw, because I was just looking back in the files, and I had 3 folders called final 1, final 2, final 3, design number 2, final submission documents, photo finals, submission 1 final. And like those are just the final folders. Never mind all the like ones. So like there's to your question of how do you decide on the scale? I think there wasn't like a decision that was made and like this is it and there it goes. There was a lot I mean, never mind the like poor file naming conventions of everything being final folder, but like there's a lot of iteration where you're looking at different scenarios, different possibilities. How does it relate to either the SAP center next door or the future projection of the urban growth around that area, or how does it relate to the scale of an individual person? I think that those things just happen through a lot of iteration and a lot of sometimes implicit and sometimes very explicit decision making.
I really liked what Tom said about finding rocks on the beach, because our whole color palette for this entire competition was based on rocks that we had found at the beach, and turned that into the color palette that we were using for that project, and it's extended onto other projects. In terms of scale, I would say it was all about operating at an infrastructural scale. Like, how can this be bigger than architecture? Didn't go as big as Tom, but I think like having the maximum amount of impact. In our case, it was really thinking about this idea of 20 acres or however much like of 20 square miles of tree growth. Like, how can you pack that much impact into a small space, a small site, while still leaving the majority of it open for recreational activity?
Oh, should I jump in, answer a little bit? To me, it was material constraints. Like how tall can something be and still be actually manageable? How light can something be and still be pre-assembled and actually put into position? So there was a lot of real world constraints that were really centered on the way I was designing the piece and understanding it. And it was also setting myself a goal. I mean, I'd seen this radio tower that was done in the 19 teens in Russia, and was just totally inspired by it because it was done with by this constructivist architect with minimal means and very primitive ways. And I kept thinking, like, how can I do something like that these days? So maybe it's a bit aspirational. It's a bit doing a little bit of research, finding the right rocks, looking at it and going, how the hell did that happen? And trying to tell yourself, set a couple of bars for yourself to see if you can actually do something similar. Obviously, it's a very different age that we're working in today, different kind of constraints that we've got. But I think that it is kind of finding those edges and finding where you can be that actually creates the scale of an element and the scale of a piece, understand of what you can try and bite off, actually.
I guess, something we didn't really talk about, and we're just about out of time here. So maybe it's something that everybody can think about a bit on their own. But what does it mean to create an icon today? Because effectively that's what's behind this brief. And do we even believe in this kind of, create something that's heroic to embody this point in time for others, right, around the world? Like, that's kind of embedded in this sort of brief. And there's a lot there to unpack, I think, and to really think about what that means today, what that means for identities and regions and cities, for occupants. What does this mean for people that exist outside of a place like Silicon Valley? Perhaps if we walk away from the notion of an icon, then perhaps we're walking away from an amazing opportunity, right? But perhaps it's kind of a different paradigm and a different way to think. So I'm certain that each of the four and many others that presented or took on this project were probably attracted just by that one question, because if an icon assumes some sort of identity, then already there's a ton of stuff to think about, right? And what do you do, right? And then the whole history architecturally, this legacy that's a part of this world. So it gets complex very quickly, and then we start to have to sort through that somehow, and you sort of make your connections along the way and say, well, here's going to be my strategy at this point in time for this particular project, right? And that's probably in some ways a super interesting way to look at the website. I imagine it's still up with all these different submissions. And just to ask that question, how have people taken on this notion of icon, right?
Okay, that does bring us to 3 minutes before 6:30, our time for concluding. Any other last thoughts? I mean, I'll just pose this at very short answers, maybe. So in reflecting upon your comment there, Thom, what does it mean to enter a competition where you may in fact not believe in the brief? So there's the counter proposal, which you were very explicit about, Thom. But it does pose maybe bigger ethical questions for us as architects, right? We can refuse briefs for sure. But also a competition in particular does provide an opportunity to speak, put forward some other ideas into the world. Or maybe even a dumber question. Did any of you think you were going to win?
I think we all did, I think we all did. No, I'm kidding. So, but I would say that it's an exploration of the research that you've been doing, and I think it's another instantiation of trying to take it to whatever scale, and I think that that's actually the reason why every one of us got involved in it. I think we do have to believe in the work. I think that would propel us. I mean, Thom, you said, no way, I didn't think it was, but I think deep down, I think you really did think you could have won it. But I think there's something about having that belief in your ideas, the belief in what you're doing, and the conviction that you can actually make something that I think would be substantial. I think that's what architects have to believe in, if I have to say. I mean, I got to believe that I'm going to win, even though the chances. I think there was over 960 people that handed in a proposal, so chances are slim to none they actually will win it. But there is something I think is good about our profession. I think we're optimists. I think we're good at seeing what the potential of something is. And you see the strength of the projects represented here. Gosh, I mean, any one of these could have been sensational. I particularly really like Thom's. I hate to say it. I think it's just awesome. And so there is something about that. I think we have to be optimistic and think we can win.
But I think many of us also would agree, since especially drawings came up quite a bit tonight, and certainly I know, my colleagues here and our teaching and everything else. I think we have to believe that so-called paper architecture or speculative architecture, architecture that exists in representation only, is also real, right? That it has currency in the world, it has currency in the discipline. Probably all of us could point to some of our favorite works of architecture, and they never existed, right? They exist on paper. They embody a certain way of thinking, a certain, a challenge to the world at the time that perhaps even still resonates generations later. So in this case, the winning thing might be a kind of, either or, as opposed to these are real ideas that now exist in the world. And that's still a thing, right? That's still a presence and it still matters. So it's not like, you either you win or nothing at all. And I think tonight, embodies that way of thinking, right? We're here to discuss something that exists on the speculative plane, right? And ideas are real. So that's my response to that.
That's a beautiful way. And I wish I could say, let's just end it on ideas are real, because that, I think maybe becomes our motto. We'll print those hats up tomorrow, Thom. But Americo Diaz in the comments also has a really good comment that I want to read into the record of the recording, which is that participation in a competition is like voting. You or your candidate may not win, but you won't have a voice if you don't participate. And I think that just states really beautifully what Thom, you were saying also, right? It's all architecture, and it's all the discourse. And so, every act of architecture is building the discourse. So thank you all so much. Thank you for sharing your projects. Thank you for sharing the connection of your work and your thinking to the college, your academic life here, the pedagogy of the college at large. It's been a really wonderful night. And thank you everyone for joining us. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.